Economics is the most important subject we have covered so far in international relations, and I'll be explaining why in three main sections. First, I will be explaining and defining economics and rationalism. Second, I will go into the expanded positive arguments for economics. Finally, I will talk about the negative arguments for economics by comparing it to the other topics in IR. The version of rationalism I will be using is not an ultra-orthodox viewpoint. Rather, it's one that can take in more constructivist points like identity and use those as preferences. Also, it will be used to model non-state actors. Economics falls very well into this category of rationalism. Economics is the interconnectedness of states via the flow of goods and services across their borders, and it's the home of principles like game theory, and often relies on financial mutual benefit to explain cooperation. So why use rationalism instead of, say, constructivism? It's because actors all want to use their policy to make an action happen. And to make policy happen, they need to have predictive power. They need to know what a market's going to do, or how it's going to impact people. And therefore, you must use rationalism because of its predictive nature. So why economics? Well, for one, it fits under rationalism the best. And it also explains two key global tensions very well. Why is it the best for rationalism? Well, many states, one of their top priorities and preferences is economics, how well their economy is doing, because a better economy means a better home front for both their people and also how powerful they are on the global stage. It also explains non-state actors very well. For example, Walmart's bottom line will be how much profit they make. The very same goes for drug traffickers in Latin America and across the world. Now, even terrorist organizations, where their main aim could be ideological, still must focus on economics, as with no guns, there is no ISIS in Syria, and there is no coups in the Sahel. The first major global trend that economics explains very well is the rise of China. China's rise from an agricultural economy to an industrialized power is due to market reforms in the 80s. But then, in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This cemented its place as the world's factory and gave it explosive growth. Now, China has gained so much economic strength, we stand on a precipice as U.S. unipolarity dissipates. The second important topic it explains is democratic backsliding. This can be seen across the world and is in part due to the way democracies function. They are premised on a social contract, that in exchange for democracy, there will be prosperity for the citizens. However, in a democracy, it is really easy to take the immediate benefit now, even though it can come at a long-term economic detriment. For example, democratic states like a lot of sovereign debt, which over time begins to eat away at the budget through interest payments. Then when a crisis like 2008 hits and prosperity starts to dissipate from the social contract, there's a turn towards populism. Less democratic, less institutionalist-based leaders. We see this with Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and these leaders are not just limited to the right. Economics best explains how both states and non-state actors act, and then it also explains very important international trends of the 21st century. Starting from the bottom and working our way up, we have race and gender last, mainly because it's an identity category which falls under constructivism. Now, race and gender theorists have good reasons for why their topic is more important than the economy. Primarily, the economies of nations and states around the world are defined by race and gender. Many jobs in the economy are gendered. Many jobs in the world are defined by race and where you are in status based off of that. However, this misses the fact that the economy actually changes gender's role. As GDP goes up, oftentimes things like gender equality do too. Furthermore, you have to consider how does race and gender get translated into policy. That means you have to use race and gender to predict people's behavior. And while it's been done before to make policy, however, it borders more on prejudice. Class and nation, in fact, cannot measure up to economics for many of the same reasons. A class and nation theorist would argue that these identity categories determine how individuals act, and states are simply composed of many individuals. And like fractals, that means that the way a class or a nation is defined will determine how states act. However, looking at classes within a state to determine behavior is kind of just a worse version of economics, because classes are defined by their economic status. Furthermore, nations are not as simple as an individual. They're not fractals. Rather, they have layers of bureaucracy, meaning decisions made by leaders are rational, and often, but not always, ones which care more about wealth than nationalism. Even autocracies have leaders with many advisors to make sure that the decisions being made are rational. In democracies, this is doubly true. A president is often graded by how the economy was when he left office. If a nation is to make a decision out of pride, though, which sometimes happens, they will be punished for that choice. For example, the US going into the Middle East, or how China had a Middle Kingdom complex which kept them from industrializing for over a century. Trains, industry, change. Though change is important, it has no real policy applications because it doesn't have a rational standing, and so can't be used. A change theorist would argue that, unlike anything economics predicts, change is the only real certainty in IR. Furthermore, it determines the economic board. The Industrial Revolution is what put Europe on top. Long-term change, though, isn't really predictable, and so you can't make an actionable, rationalist policy out of it. However, some parts of change you can, as seen by, the Industrial Revolution. However, even there, it only matters so much as it helps strengthen your nation's economics. The UK only benefited from industrialization because it exploded their economy. US and China. The AI revolution will, and probably somehow, change the dynamics between the countries, but it's going to be how they use AI to enhance their economies. Transnational theorists perhaps have some of the best reasons why their topic is more important than economics. If there's so much mutual benefit in fixing a pandemic or climate change together, then why don't countries do it? However, this is a misframing of the issues, because economics actually is what explains why transnational problems can't be solved. For example, microeconomics gives us the free rider problem, which basically explains why issues like climate change or pandemics aren't addressed on a transnational level. Further, if the economic interests of states aligned, they would actually be able to solve these problems. For example, the US and China compete on green energy. This is why China subsidizes its EV industry so much, which means that great leaps forward in EV technology have happened. Furthermore, when the US began pulling back on renewable energies in the Paris Accords, that's when China announced that it won't stray from the course and it'll start leading the green revolution. Now we're on our way to the Supreme Court to talk about law and agreements. Fun fact, Supreme Court Justice Jackson actually presided over the Nuremberg trials, so he actually came up with most of the basis of international law through those trials. And that means most international law and agreements are coming out of a liberal perspective and the norms of the West. Law and agreement theorists would say that without institutions like the IMF or the World Trade Organization, trade would drop off, and therefore economics wouldn't matter nearly as much. With a decrease in trade comes demise of the importance of economics. However, this misses something. In truth, with zero international agreements, international trade still happens. Let's turn back the clock to the 1800s US-China relations to see why. China has just lost the Opium Wars, and there's no standardization for trade, yet US-China trade is booming, in part due to the gold standard, not something created out of an international agreement, but simply emergent from respective domestic economies. Speaking about the past, empire hegemony theorists would argue that their topic actually created the economic status quo, because it is the global north countries that control the World Trade Organization, or the IMF. So, it is up to the hegemons to steer the economy, not the economy steering state decisions. However, this misses something from diplomacy, specifically two-level games. Domestic games, which will be defined by economics in a democracy and even authoritarian countries. Therefore, international relations of those games will be determined by economic conditions. For example, in a democratic country, a voter's main issue is often the economy. Just look at the 2024 elections around the world. And even if the economy suffers too much in an authoritarian country, the people will revolt. Just look at the founding of the US or even the revolutions in China. Empire and hegemony also doesn't immediately explain the rise of China, as China's rise has been against former empires and now is challenging the US. Further, economics is the best way to see why the third world has not improved, because free trade locks in underdevelopment of countries. Now on to War and Peace, the white whale. War and Peace theorists have very good reasons for why economics might be better. For example, a liberal War and Peace theorist would say that, interdependence is why states don't go to war. Look at the EU. So much interdependence economically is to preserve the peace. Therefore, economics only matters as long as it provides peace. Now, a realist rationalist would argue that, wealth is not an independent goal. Rather, states want a larger economy in order to fuel their military and build it up for the purpose of war. Therefore, war is more important than an economy. However, if that was the case, we would see almost every single penny of the economy actually going into the military. Now, this has happened before. Just look at the USSR. They were a military superpower. However, they were an economic midget. And, just look at who ended up winning the Cold War. All of these reasons are why economics is the most important topic in IR, along with it explaining US-China relations and democratic backsliding the best through rationalist policy.